Hello, and welcome to the Decent Ideas podcast, where decent needn't necessarily mean polite in an indecent time, nor should it mean perfect for obvious reasons. What it must mean is fitting and suitable to that time. I'm Terence. So at this point, we've talked a solid bit about recent political movements and the state of political change, or lack thereof, in this country. And I've alluded a bit to incrementalism and kind of where it has left us. But in light of some backlash to Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's interview with the Democratic Socialists of America, I wanted to discuss a little bit about theories of political and societal change. So for those of you who don't know, the Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA, is the largest socialist nonprofit organization in the U.S. that also supports a number of labor movements. And AOC is a member and endorsed candidate out of, I believe it's 5 elected members of the House of Representatives. So a very powerful organization, at least relatively speaking, on the left, the political left of this country. So with that context, let's get into it. So there are any number of kind of theories of societal and political change, and they often rely on particular coalition building, pivotal windows of opportunity and time, sustained collective action, certain levels of popular support, mass news media coverage, sufficiently charismatic political figures, etc. And they kind of vary across academic disciplines, including political science, sociology, and psychology. So to kind of set the stage, I wanted to kind of go through what I've seen as kind of the 2 biggest political changes by and through government and popular movements in the US. And those 2 are, for me, the Affordable Care Act, which was signed into law on March 23rd, 2010, that covered an additional 23 million Americans and allowed young adults to stay on parents' health insurance until the age of 26. This was a big thing for me personally, as someone who was, just about to graduate college and was concerned about, how I'd afford healthcare. And maybe we'll have another opportunity to talk more about my healthcare journey as a whole. But suffice it to say that this felt like a big deal as someone who at the time was a big Obama fan, shall we say. Perhaps an unyielding Obama fan, shall we say. And then the second major case that felt, very close to me was the Obergefell versus Hodges case, which is the Supreme Court case that was decided on June 26, 2015, that overturned another court case called Baker versus Nelson, which upheld the right of states to restrict marriage licenses. And so this case that overturned that case held that all states are required to issue marriage certificates to same-sex couples and effectively legalized same-sex marriage all around the United States. As someone who had a number of friends that waited a very long time, someone growing up in Colorado, which was a, relatively moderate state as I was growing up, we had a lot of, closeted kids in our grade, and it was, just powerful to see, so many of them feel like they could come out and, be recognized as being equally protected under the law as far as marriage was concerned. And, so for me, as just one guy, these were 2 moments that were, to me, felt like big political changes that were achieved, in large part due to political movement and ultimately government, I guess, affirmation of that movement or those movements. So, yeah, to that end, I thought it might also help in terms of framing this to talk about, kind of the latest attempts that we've addressed to some extent over the course of these last several episodes of the podcast. So I'm going to list these as kind of attempts to create political or societal change and or force rhetorical shifts in our politics. And perhaps it's, overstating to say none of these really succeeded in changing or shifting, the real political dynamics in the country, but they feel relevant. Force the vote was a big one. I was a proponent of it and continue to believe that it's a solid, tactic to use the clout that you have as a minority part of the majority party to kind of push the majority party to make real political change. Obviously, thus far, it appears that this hasn't been, enacted by members of Congress. And in particular, what we're talking about is, the Squad, AOC, Rashid Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and so on and so forth. So, relevant, right? Of course, on the other side, Stop the Steal, the effort which garnered a huge number of representatives in the House of Representatives on the Republican side to claim that the election was fraudulent and to support efforts to overturn the election. And so, we talked about these in our very first episode, A Tale of Two Hashtags, which you should definitely check out if you haven't yet. Still feels every bit as relevant today as then. But so we kind of have, I guess, two successor movements, if you will. Again, these are largely online movements, but nevertheless attempts to shift, the political discourse, the political rhetoric, and make political change happen. So #Fraud Squad is one we haven't really gotten into. I think I might have touched on it in a previous episode. But, this idea that because they decided not to use their leverage and force the vote on Medicare for all, or really for that matter, to make an effort on $15 minimum wage in that capacity in the latest stimulus bill that Biden signed. This idea has arisen that, these aren't really people that we can trust, despite claiming to be on the left and supporters of major shifts in political programs like Medicare for All and the Green New Deal and what have you. And, obviously there's a big discussion to be had to what extent, this is a fair assessment of their advocacy and their work in Congress. And then I guess there's sort of a more amorphous kind of successor to Stop the Steal on the right, which is a poll recently came out that basically said that 60% of Republicans still believe the election was stolen, and 50% of Republicans believe that the riots on the Capitol on January 6th were either a false flag operation by the left wing or were just, nonviolent and therefore not something to be worried about, right? And this allows, obviously them to skirt responsibility both within, the political centers of power for Republicans that, we didn't actually really do anything wrong in calling the election fraudulent. We didn't encourage any untoward action on the part of our supporters. And then obviously for the supporters to say, those folks that did what they did, not a big deal, or even, still a positive thing, which suggests that perhaps things of this nature could continue, which is, a not unconcerning thought, shall we say. And so that leads to kind of a couple of particular theories of societal change that I've seen from the left recently. The first is drawn from Leninist politics, if you will, which is to say the creation of a new Vanguard Party, which would be a party at the fore of a mass action political movement and revolution of the proletariat or working class. And this has been espoused online by Ryan Knight, who's a very popular podcaster and activist on the left, and it's also been popularized to a lesser extent, but a still relevant one, by the appropriately named Vanguard podcast, which has come to my attention is worth checking out on the left for a sort of sense of the fullness of online perspectives on the political left. And, we have these attempts to create, political parties on the left or bolster them. So in the case of creating them, the People's Party, the Movement for People's Party, is, trying to make a name for themselves. And obviously the Green Party has been around for quite a while in this country and, are still attempting to make gains and get some political clout to make waves, really, in the U.S. political system. And yeah, this theory of the case is important, that, if we can pull together a coalition of the left to build a new political party, perhaps it could, challenge the political establishment that exists, within the party duopoly of the country. And worth examining. And obviously, we talked about this already, but another theory of societal change that retains rhetorical force on the left is the force of the vote paradigm, espoused by Jimmy Dore and Brianna Joy Gray and several others, to basically say, when there is a small majority, small factions can exert outsized political influence on the state of play. And I see this as, a meaningful approach to how we get political change in this country. The fact that it hasn't been, brought to bear by members of Congress suggests that there's a reason why those politicians that are being pushed to force the vote, it begs the question, well, why aren't they getting on board with this idea? Perhaps they have some other strategy in mind, but I would definitely hazard to say that, the fact that they haven't shared that strategy doesn't help their case, right? If you want to get us on board, tell us what your plan is. And so I would say that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has suffered at least somewhat among the online left, if you will, in terms of, it sounds harsh, but in terms of her credibility. We should always be allowed to hold our elected officials accountable. That's why we put them in there in the first place. They're supposed to represent us. If they don't represent us, then what are they there for, and why should we keep them there? And of course, I encourage folks to check out the DSA interview with AOC and decide for themselves, kind of where they stand on her position on, like I alluded to before, incrementalism and how we make political change happen. So quickly, a couple other theories of political change that have been making the rounds at the very least, and in some cases gaining great steam, is the sort of state-by-state issue approach. So I've been turned on to Whole Washington, which is an organization that advocates for Medicare for All in the state of Washington, and appears to be making at least some inroads there to get a state approach to Medicare for All on the books, which is laudable. And yeah, I'll leave it at that on that piece. It's good stuff for sure. And then of course the corporate accountability approach, if you will, of the Amazon union vote in Bessemer, I believe I pronounced that right, Bessemer, Alabama, to get a union for one of the biggest companies in the world, with a CEO that's made billions of dollars while many have struggled in the pandemic. So and sort of the legislative corollary approach is the PRO Act, which I believe I talked about last time, which is all about increasing employees' rights to organize and collectively bargain. This is, of course, something I strongly support. The increase in the ability for labor unions to form would be huge for this country, for workers' rights, and hopefully we'll see some movement there, albeit it will be difficult to pass. I think, as I said last time, it will be difficult to pass the PRO Act into law without abolishing the filibuster. So I guess to get into kind of the meat and potatoes of it today, the decent ideas of the day, if you will. And I think I've alluded to these before, but it felt relevant, when we have all of these theories of change that I've brought to the table today and shared with you. These are great ideas, right? And have had mixed success, but like I said, I think all the ones I mentioned, aside from the hashtags of the online left that are ultimately just that, right? Just online rhetoric. These actual movements that move the 8-ball in terms of getting our attention and getting us thinking about, okay, how do we actually get legislative change to happen? These are great. So I guess, at the end of the day, though, I think it's important to recognize the limitations, right, of some of these ideas. And I think the struggle, to pick one in particular, of building a Vanguard Party of the left right now, is that there are a lot of strong personalities, right, on the online left that has spilled over into media discourse and what have you, that aren't really making the effort to build fulsome coalitions. How can you have a Vanguard Party if you can't bring the workers together? If you can't bring the left together? This kind of online squabbling And that feels harsh to say, but we're at a point where people are going back to brunch, people are going back to sleep. With the Biden rollout of vaccines going all right, generally, it allows people to kind of check out from politics. And so, if you pair that with a degree to which the left is divided and factionalized, it's hard to make the case that a Vanguard Party is in the immediate offing, right? And similarly, or I guess on another note, the Force the Vote initiative or strategy, however you want to put it, which, like I said, I do in principle completely support, hasn't gotten our congresspeople or the ones that we consider our closest allies on board. And so whether or not you think these are the right allies, whether you think we should vote them out in 2022 or not, that's probably a big question worth an episode of its own. I don't know. We'll see. But for the time being, we have the representatives we have until 2023, like it or not. And so the question becomes, all right, how do we make change with what we have? And so, kind of bringing those two pieces together, the Vanguard Party idea and the sort of legislative strategy idea of forcing the vote, to me, what it gets to is this conclusion that I've drawn, which is that sometimes it's best to recognize those you can't work with and build a solution that goes around them. And I think the way I brought it up in a previous episode is that I see this as consent as applied to deal making. And I don't know, I like that one. In any case, the idea of building a big tent doesn't mean you have to agree on all the issues, but it can mean that you agree on structural change that will foster real debate on the issues. So when it comes to building a coalition on the left or a coalition in the center or what have you, it doesn't mean you have to agree on all the issues. What it does mean is you have to build a system, right, that allows you to have the disagreements that you have around the issues and build political change from there. And what that also means is you can't dismiss potential allies or make assumptions about their intentions. And this is the shortcoming, as I see it, of just lambasting the squad as the fraud squad. I have trouble seeing how this makes real substantive change if it makes you abandon electoralism altogether and you go the route of, we just need a general strike, which, by the way, I'm a supporter of a general labor strike. If it's, framed with the right goals in mind, the right objectives to say, this is what we want out of this, which again goes to the problem of, is there a strategy in the political left? So suffice it to say, you can't dismiss potential allies or make assumptions about their intentions if you're going to build a big tent, if you're going to get people on board, if you're going to build a vanguard, in the sort of general sense of the word. And that also means, by the way, you can't idealize potential allies either. And this has been a huge bit of learning for me. And, credit to Ryan Knight, who's, whose politics I don't always agree with. And I don't consider myself a socialist. I consider myself a left libertarian, as I've discussed on the podcast before. But he did hammer home the point for me that we need to stop this notion of hero worship, I guess is how I've referred to it, for these figures that we expect to carry the torch for us and move the ball forward. I think as I've said on Twitter, don't make a hero, don't idolize either AOC or @Proud Socialist Ryan Knight on Twitter. And, this is obviously a pretty online only conversation, but to bring it back to sort of the broader statement, you got to form coalitions with people that you don't always agree with or people that you agree with, but recognize that they're not to be put on a pedestal. It doesn't serve anyone to put folks on a pedestal. You need a leader for a movement, and I don't think I've made any secret of the fact that I thought Bernie Sanders was a figure that was able to unite a large part of the left, and obviously there's a big discussion to be had about the degree to which he succeeded, that he only got somewhere around I want to say mid 30s, the polls in the primary in 2020. But so you need leaders, but don't idealize your leaders. So yeah, I guess this all goes to, we keep this idea, right? We keep wanting a robust third party on the left, but it seems we aren't willing to make the effort to gather together that coalition. And so this gets to something I've talked about and is, a large thrust of my political advocacy in general, and that's the move to decentralize the U.S. So I believe in federal decentralization in no small part because it means recognizing the people in areas of the country that it makes the most sense to try and work with, and by extension, those that it makes the least sense to work with. As it is, the US is such a big country that finding real common ground on meaningful policy change is awfully difficult. And so I believe that, building regional coalitions, and obviously you can build trans-regional coalitions through or to augment those regional coalitions. But if you do that, then you have the makings of a real political change, as I see it. And so you can pair that with these other movements these other strategies, these other theories of change that I've talked about. So that is the piece of advocacy that I will continue to be making a cornerstone of my work outside the restaurant, of course. And so, by this point, we've talked about the elements of federal decentralization as I've sort of started to lay them out on this podcast are things like building a human-centered economy, which is less dependent on corporate philanthropy, where regions can determine the degree to which humans are centered, but it generally creates a framework for lessening inequality and thereby building movements of people that are regionally aligned, that are politically aligned. So that's no small thing, right? And then I've talked about, anti-bigotry and building an anti-bigotry and anti-exploitation civil rights framework for workers, consumers, and voters, which is basically about democratizing society to decrease discrimination and also decrease the power imbalance between average citizens and the powerful and well-connected. And I've also gone into restorative justice and the idea that people can be made more accountable for their own justice, which makes for less centralized legal systems. Obviously, of course, if accountability isn't accepted by the alleged offender, then a retributive court of peers is reasonable. And so that's why I don't see these systems, as I've laid them out, as entirely supplantive, I believe that's a word, of current systems, but a reframing of these systems in a way that is more politically inclusive and allows, like I say, the building of these regional coalitions that I see as being potentially quite powerful. And so I delayed this episode, but I'm hoping to get into very soon, maybe next episode, hopefully, a discussion of building a new international system for people, planet, and progress. We need to build coalitions with other willing actors, as I've talked about, work with the people that sounds obvious to say it out loud, but are open to agreement, right? And then that allows us to convince unwilling actors that they will be effectively on the outside looking in. So if that's fine with them, so be it. In any case, this is sort of generally this framework as I see it for how you build real political change. And I'll admit this is untested as an idea, but it comes from the background that I built around building real software that really changes the way, like, our relationship to technology and our relationship to information. And it goes to the background that I have in international relations and conflict resolution, and how you get people to work together to the extent that they can work together. And so, normally this is where I talk about what keeps it from being a decent idea. But I guess what I'll say, I'll be unique in this episode in saying we should try this. This is a new, as I see it, maybe there's a system out there that's very similar to this, a theory of political change that's out there. But as far as I see, this is an untested, solid idea worth thinking about. How do we build a coalition that's powerful, that's strong, that can be even bigger than these, those two major political changes that I mentioned, which aren't really that big, right? The, ACA and the gay marriage decision is obviously monumental and very important, but, talking about something that brings along everybody, right? And, that takes recognizing those you can't work with and build a solution that goes around them. That takes, building a big tent where you're not necessarily agreeing on all the issues, but you agree that structural change is needed. Don't dismiss potential allies. Don't idealize potential allies. This is the framework, and hopefully I'll have more opportunities to discuss this with you guys, but it struck me as important to really get at. I've found myself really frustrated at this idea of, we're just gonna build a third party and it's gonna be great. Okay, but how do you do that? And no offense meant, genuine solidarity and respect for these people that have these solid political theories of change. But I'm gonna make the strong case for mine as I've laid it out for you today. So please let me know what you think. As always, I'm available on Twitter at DecentFedPROJ, and we'll leave it at that for today. So depending on how you're taking this in, you should know that the podcast is available on YouTube by searching Decent Federalism Project, and on most audio podcast platforms by searching Decent Ideas Podcast. And next time, we'll discuss a new and hopefully timely issue that deserves a new set of eyes. I'm trying to do foreign policy next time, we'll see. Until then, be decent to one another. I hope you fare well. And thanks so much for listening.